With gratitude always, I introduce our president, Gayle Beebe, to speak in chapel. There's a line about David at the end of Psalm 78 that says, God sent David to lead with integrity of heart and with skillful hands. So being a president, being a leader takes some skill, it takes some knowledge, but above all, it takes integrity. It takes a heart that's right. And I don't know any president of any college in the United States who so skillfully integrates the theology of the Christian life with the life of a student and the life of a college. Gayle Beebe is just, these handouts you're getting, keep them. You understand about a quarter of them right now, but just keep listening, hold on to them. These things are marvelous, and they're a great example of what it means to bring a lot together under the preeminence of Jesus Christ. So Gayle, welcome to chapel. Good to see you again. Up here.
Thank you. Well, we're going to leave the lights up today so that if you take notes, you'll have the opportunity to actually see the handout. When I was coming in this morning, Ben came over to me. He said, you know, this is so rich. It's just so incredible. We really should try and divide these into two halves or into two sessions. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go for 2 hours this morning. No. But really what Ben was saying to me was, you know, I think you put too much in the outline. And so we're going to have to work through it effectively. But you're Westmont students, and so of course you're overachievers, and that won't be any problem at all. The outline is really set up to remind you of what it means to have a life with God. And on the facing page, you have these concentric circles of reality. The outer circle are the 7 paths of Christian devotion. The next circle is the 6 ways in which we come to theological understanding. The third circle are the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5. And I think one of the easiest and best ways for us to assess the quality of our life with God is to, on a daily basis, ask ourselves, do we exhibit these fruits of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. It is so easy to do that evaluation in the morning, so easy to do it at night. And I think if we're mindful and attentive, that we begin to realize that the times at which we don't exhibit the fruit of the Spirit is a result of being out of sync with God and out of sync with those whom God has placed in our life. Jesus summarized the law and the prophets in Matthew 22 by saying very briefly, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And when you think about it, all of life comes down to our capacity to love God and to love our neighbor. And the times at which we're out of sync with either of those, our life will be out of sync, and we won't be able to demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit, nor will we be able to be all that God has intended for us. And when you turn inside the fruit of the Spirit, learning to think theologically, 7 approaches to our life with God really spell out what I just summarized on the facing page. And it brings us to one of my all-time favorite characters in the history of the church. There are so many reasons to read Evagrius. One might be that the council in 553 found him to be a heretic. And just out of curiosity, you should always read, who did the church decide were heretics? Origen was also labeled a heretic at that council, and both were later restored. Their reputations were resuscitated. But Evagrius pushed up against the boundaries of what it meant to understand our life with God. And he has a very interesting biography. He was raised near Constantinople, or what we know today as Istanbul. Of course, we have Westmont in Istanbul going on this very moment. I'm excited for what our students will experience there, as well as Jim and Heather, who are leading the group. But Istanbul has always been a beautiful city. It's been a city, a cosmopolitan city, a city located in one of the most beautiful places in all the earth. And also it's attracted people from vast backgrounds and empires. And so think about Evagrius in Constantinople. He's being mentored by the Cappadocian Fathers, really the leaders of the church of the day. And he is headed for high churchly office. He is going to have a premier position. But he does one of the most dreadful things a person can do. He fell in love with a married woman. Now, there's all kinds of questions around it. The details are really vague. People speculate about all manner of things regarding this love of this married woman. What we do know is that he began to realize that his life was threatened, and he fled Constantinople for Jerusalem. He was there for just a little bit and realized his life would be better protected if he were on the Egyptian desert. And he literally went from Constantinople to Jerusalem, Jerusalem to the Egyptian desert. As far as we can tell, never left. And there's so many times when I've wondered about what he must have gone through as he rethought his life. Living in one of the most beautiful places on the earth, one of the most cosmopolitan cities, one of the most intellectually and spiritually stimulating places on all the earth. And because of his own discretion, he was now left on the Egyptian desert to think through his life and really to think through his life with God. Well, out of that very morbid experience came some of the richest understandings of our life with God and this tremendous excavation of the human soul. And I want to take you through it because I think it is so profound and just so compelling in terms of what we can learn about our own life with God from really understanding Evagrius. Evagrius summarized his findings into these 8 deadly thoughts. Gregory the Great, who would live in the 6th and early 7th centuries, and 2 years from now we'll come to him, he would compress these into the 7 deadly sins. And if you've been familiar with the 7 deadly sins, you know that they really reflect the ways in which we've understood the massive temptations that people, humans, have faced through the ages, including the massive temptations that you and I still face today. Now, I want to start with this scripture passage from Philippians 4:8 because we're going to come back to it at the end. And if I make good time, and I'm intending to make good time, at the very end we're going to take a brief, probably no more than 3 minutes if we have it, to reflect on Philippians 4:8. So let's begin by reading it. We're going to go through Evagrius and then some of the most rich discoveries recently of neuroscience, and then come to the end and really reflect again on this passage. Finally, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Evagrius really believed that all of our temptations in life begin in the mind. In fact, he believes all of our actions as humans begin in the mind. And so he talks extensively about what do you give your mind to? Do you give your mind to these things from Philippians 4:8 that awaken in us the greatest, most noble desires of the human spirit? Or do we give ourselves to the most debased thoughts and so go into a life of debauchery? And you can only imagine what he was thinking as he worked his way through these excavations. Certainly the ones that pertain to him, but the ones that he would observe in others, in the monks with whom he lived, as well as the travelers who would visit and stay with them. He summarized it into these 8 deadly thoughts, beginning with gluttony. And what he observed is that the monks would often grow weary and fearful that they would not have enough food. And so he observed that instead of being able to just graciously accept people and practice hospitality, they would hoard food. And they would begin to hoard all of their belongings so as to be sure that they would have enough for later on. And he realized that it was really a result of their lack of ability to trust in God, their lack of ability to believe in the future, and their lack of confidence that life would ultimately turn out all right or okay. Now, what's its application today? One of the ways in which I think that we become susceptible to gluttony is not so much that we overindulge in food, because food is a pretty predictable part of our life. But where we do overindulge is just in chronic overwork. The fear that the opportunities that we want will not be there for us. And so we just have this habit or this pattern of falling into all kinds of compulsive behaviors that are really a manifestation of a very similar fear that Evagrius first identified as gluttony. Now, the antidote for that is temperance, recognizing that there will always be enough and that God will provide based on our capacity to trust. And it really comes back to that spiritual quality of to what extent can you really trust God, and to what extent can you really trust the promises of God to provide for your future. The second one is anger. And anger is such a prominent part of our culture today, such a prominent part of world history. It has motivated governments, it has motivated bands of people. It's even at the heart of civic and local governments. And yet we realize that anger ultimately just pulls communities apart and brings ruin. Evagrius referred to anger as the most fierce passion. In fact, he defined it as a boiling and stirring up of wrath against those who we perceive to have given us harm. Now, he goes on to talk about what causes us to be angry. And he said, often the reasons in which we feel angry begin with the fact that we feel an agreement that we've reached has been violated, or the predictable patterns of our life have been disrupted and we don't like it, or people don't really take our needs into consideration when they're working out their behavior in life. But he said, ultimately, anger is a result of our desire to actually control the lives of others. And we're so upset over the fact that we cannot control others. And as a result, it creates this boiling passion within us that just erupts. And the result of that is that it destroys community. Now, we're going to come back to anger at the end because our very recent neuroscience research has shown how disruptive anger actually is, both to the brain and to the chemistry, the biochemistry of the human body. Evagrius says the Christian virtue or the godly virtue is mildness, which reflects a capacity for self-restraint. Whether a principle has been violated or simply we feel a great deal of frustration, we can respond with a sense of mildness because we place the concern in the greater purposes of God. I think this takes incredible discipline, and I don't think we grow to this automatically. But when we become aware of the fact that we have impulses towards anger, I think it's a greater reminder to us that we need to do more work, and that we need to do more spiritual work in our relationship with God in order to have the capacity and the skills to actually make a proper response. One of the great challenges of life is learning how to self-regulate. And one of the great challenges for you as you go forward in life will be the capacity to which you can understand your circumstances, evaluate them properly, and then make an appropriate response. During my adult life, I have so often seen people with great opportunities ruin the opportunity because they didn't have the capacity to self-regulate, and often they ruin the opportunity simply because of the outbursts of anger. And I encourage you to really think about what are the areas in which you find yourself susceptible in college. You're never going to be under more pressure than you are now in terms of repeatedly having to face deadlines, repeatedly having to perform to the expectations of others. And as you sort out what are the places in which you experience one of the disorienting passions that Evagrius speaks to, what are the ways in which this can awaken in you a deeper desire for God in order that you can cultivate the virtues and the resources to make a proper response? The next deadly thought is greed. Greed or avarice essentially means to have no limit in our desire. It is boundless in its grasping for money especially, but also it can be boundless in its grabbing for fame, or most importantly, for the need that we feel, to allow the minds of others to be filled with ourselves. It reflects a lack of respect for the needs of others because our own needs override any sense of boundary. Now, he contrasts this with generosity, and he said, generosity overcomes greed by recognizing that our greatest good is found in sharing with others. And I so often encounter people who are generous. So many people that are generous to the college are some of the finest human beings I've ever met. And what is so striking to me about them is that they have this capacity to recognize that God has been gracious to them in providing for their needs, and they want to provide for the needs of the college. And one of the wonderful parts of this is that it would be so easy for them to fall into patterns of saying, I just want a little more, I just want a little more. But instead, they have developed this capacity to really look out and say, I have enough. In fact, I have way more than enough. How can I help others who have legitimate needs really meet those needs? And this comes from a spirit of generosity. The next deadly thought, I think this is one that is just so pervasive in our culture and often one that's pervasive in college, is the deadly thought of envy. I think what happens with envy is really resenting the gifts that God has given to others. And it blinds us to being able to celebrate the gifts that God has given us. And the way in which I think this blocks us is it keeps us from really recognizing the contribution that God wants us to make. Now, I believe each one of you have been given by God the gifts and abilities to make a unique contribution. And it's up to you, it is your responsibility to develop those gifts and abilities and to find the place in which you can make that contribution. Certainly, we're here to help. We're here to teach, to mentor, and to even help you get those first experiences that will launch you deep into your adult life. But in the midst of that, we also need you peer-to-peer to work with your classmates, your dorm mates, your floor mates, your friends, in ways that actually celebrate the gifts and abilities that God has given them, because you're able to recognize the gifts and abilities that God has given you. And in this way, we build a community that truly honors Christ and gives us an opportunity to really express the full fruit of the Spirit. Evagrius said that happiness or contentment is the godly virtue because it reflects the capacity to celebrate the mutual contribution that we all need to make, because we're able to recognize the mutual gifts that God has given to each one of us. The fifth deadly thought, pride. Pride is a result of a disproportionate sense of our own contribution. Now, isn't that a nice way to say it? I think Evagrius just sometimes is so understated in terms of, when you're around a prideful or boastful person, it's just so annoying because they really can't see that as good as they are in this particular area, ultimately there's going to be somebody better, and that they don't cover all the areas. And it's really an inability to recognize that as good as they are in one area, God has given gifts and abilities to others who are really developing those as well. Humility in the classic Christian sense meant to find your proper place in the universe, to recognize where your contribution should be made, and to not have a disproportionate sense of it. Humility really helps us realize the role that God wants us to play in His purposes, and to avoid being threatened or to experience feelings of being threatened because of the gifts and abilities that God has given to others. Now, another deadly thought, number 6, and this is one that Evagrius obviously struggled with, lust and the way in which it brought ruin on his life and the way in which it can bring ruin on our lives. Lust results from egocentrism and the belief that other people exist simply to satisfy our own physical desires. Evagrius went to great length and detail to explain the way in which lust is so seductive, because you convince yourselves that people do want to satisfy you and that they exist to satisfy you, and that the only way in which you can get around in life or get on in life is to satisfy these desires by using other people. He went on to balance this by saying that the godly virtue is chastity. And chastity not in some kind of prudish sense, but really in the classic sense of accepting the responsibility to love those you have chosen to love. To rein in your own unbridled desires and to channel your love in a way that honors God. The 7th and 8th deadly thoughts, indifference and melancholy, are really for older people like me and Ben. And this is really where 30 years from now, when you return from your class reunion and I'm in my final year as president, we'll talk about indifference. But indifference really looks at, as you hit the middle range of life, you begin to wonder if the way you're spending your life matters. And this really often causes people to lose confidence. And they begin disenchanted, and you hear about a midlife crisis. Well, midlife crisis is one form of a feeling that your life really isn't counting, and the contribution you're trying to make isn't being valued. And Evagrius saw this in the lives of the monks, perhaps felt it a little himself. But he said diligence, persevering in the face of all of these obstacles, is really important, because ultimately God is the source of our sense of meaning, and God is the source of really being able to realize that our life has mattered and that it counts. And then finally, he concludes with melancholy, the fear that our life hasn't mattered at all. And often I see this in people as they age or as they retire. They begin to wonder, did my life really count? Did the way I spent my life really live up to all the hopes and dreams? And how did I manage all of the setbacks? How did I manage the frustrations and disappointments that are a real part of everyone's life? And Evagrius says that wisdom, which is the godly virtue, is the way in which we can come to an understanding of how our life has mattered and how we can make a contribution to the generations that will follow, that will really honor the life that we've lived, but also give the next generation a chance to make their own contribution. Now, I love Evagrius. He was, just one of these great saints of the 4th century who had a very compromised life at the beginning and then just aspired to honor God and gave his life to great purposes. More recently, there's been these fascinating studies with neuroscience. I love talking to Dr. Tom Fikes, who runs our psychology and neuroscience program, or he's certainly been at the core of it. Brenda is now the chair of the department, Brenda Smith. But as you look into neuroscience, it's just fascinating to me to see what we're learning about the human brain and the way in which all of these great classic writers had intuitions that could not be proven by science but are so congruent with science. And so this book that came out in 2009, How God Changes Our Brain, when I began to read it, it is all over the map. And it's certainly by no means an explicitly Christian book. If you've read the book, Dr. Newberg starts the book in this way. He says, now, many of you are wondering, do I believe in God? He said, I'm not even sure God exists. My associate, Mark, he doesn't believe God exists at all. I'm not sure. But what we can prove to you is believing God exists is fundamentally good for you as a human being. Now, I love that kind of backdoor compliment to God, because he's saying whether or not we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that God exists, we can prove to you that believing that God exists and living your life as if God exists is fundamentally good for you. And there's so much in this book, and it would take a lot longer than a couple sessions to go through. And so I just wanted to summarize for you in the hopes that this was kind of alight your interest. Some of the thoughts that Dr. Newberg shares and the way in which they're directly applicable to the way in which we should live our life. He said there's 5 basic things that he would want you to know about what they've discovered regarding the human brain and the role of personal reflection, religious contemplation, and its effect on the human brain. He said that if every one of us would engage in 12 minutes of personal reflection and prayer each day, it would have a profound effect on our brain. In fact, he identifies that it strengthens a unique neural circuit that specifically enhances our social awareness and empathy, and otherwise, it gives us a sense of our neighbor. It gives us a sense of how do we actually love our neighbor by developing a heightened sense of social awareness and empathy. It also has the effect of subduing destructive feelings and emotions. And what is one of the most destructive feelings and emotions? Anger. What does anger do? Anger isolates us from other people. It cuts us off. It destroys community. We retract within ourselves. Now, the second is neuroplasticity. And the first time that I heard Dr. Fikes use this word, I thought, boy, that just doesn't make sense, that the brain would be fixed like a plastic mold, neuroplasticity. And then I began to read, what is neuroplasticity? It's just the opposite. It's not that our brain is fixed like a plastic mold. It's that our brain is so nimble. Now, the old view of the brain was that your brain basically grows and develops for several years, and then it reaches a point in which it begins to go into decay, and it just slowly erodes, some more rapidly than others. What they've discovered, what the neuroscience field has discovered, is that our brains are constantly going through change as a result of experiences and behaviors that we engage in every day. And in fact, Dr. Newberg, in his book, as he's analyzing this, talks about the very fact that you can have memories that continue to take on new forms simply by the way in which you repeat those memories. That as you go through life, you edit memories of experiences earlier in life, and these become memories that are even independent of the things you're remembering. It just goes on, and I could drown you in a volume of detail, but the main thing is our brains continue to grow and develop, and we need to be mindful of that. Now, why do we need to be mindful? They can develop in good ways, they can develop in destructive ways, and we're not ever at a fixed point. And so the disciplines that we engage in every day, every week, every year, really will fundamentally shape not only our today, but the destiny of our life. The third is that our brain will constantly change. The fourth is that prayer and personal reflection helps us maintain a healthy balance. And I really believe that every one of us needs to spend a small portion of every day in personal prayer and reflection. That I need it, you need it. No matter how busy you are, you have got to find the space so that you can think through, what are my priorities? What are my values? How am I living up to them? How am I not living up to them? And what adjustments do I need to make? And then finally, Dr. Newberg, through this vast study, has been able to prove that spending 12 minutes a day in prayer and personal reflection will fundamentally shape your brain in ways that are positive. And he summarizes these in so many different respects, but he talks about the way in which we maintain a healthy brain and give ourselves an opportunity to live a vibrant and healthy life. Now, I know these 8 ways to maintain a healthy brain are kind of funny. Ben and I were laughing that we should spend, 3 minutes yawning, 5 minutes smiling, and 1 minute in aerobic activity. But these are the 8 things he says. Maintain faith, dialogue with others, stay in community, the importance of dialoguing with others or being in a conversation with others. Aerobic exercise, prayer and personal reflection, yawning. And he actually goes through an extensive treatment of how yawning actually focuses our attention. There's a brilliant young man just yawning his life away. I bet my next point will really come home to you. Listen to 12 minutes of relaxing music every day. We should have Michael Schossberger put together, 7 different soundtracks, 12 minutes each, that we could use throughout the year. Stay intellectually active. What do we want? We want you to be a lifelong learner. And then smile. And he goes through this exhaustive treatment of how smiling just fundamentally builds community, because people who see a person smiling are drawn to them. People who see a person angry or frowning are obviously pushed away. Now, I know, it's honestly, it's a great book. You don't have time to read it now, but I hope you have a chance to read it sometime in your life, and hopefully sooner than later. Now, here's where I want to bring it together. I want to try and bring Dr. Newberg's work, How God Changes Our Brain, together with Evagrius. And I was trying to think which deadly thought would make the most sense. And the one that makes the most sense is really, I think the safest, is anger. What is an emotion that we all experience, that men experience, women experience? We may express ourselves differently. Extroverts express themselves differently than introverts. But we all struggle at one time or another with the emotion of anger. Dr. Newberg says that of all the emotions we are born with, anger is the most primal and difficult to control. It interrupts the functioning of our frontal lobes. Anger causes us to lose the capacity for compassion and empathy. It also releases a cascade of neurochemicals that actually destroy those parts of the brain that control emotional reactivity. In other words, we lose our capacity to self-regulate, to make a measured response regardless of what the stimulus is. Now, he goes on to say, by contrast, when we intently and consistently focus on our spiritual values, we increase the blood flow to our frontal lobes and to our anterior cingulate, which causes the activity and emotional centers of our brain to decrease. And we develop the capacity to make the kinds of response that really are honoring of the situation and maintain community and even restore community. But conscious intention is the key. The more we focus on our inner values, the more we can take charge of our life. I know we're right up near the end, but we still have a few minutes. And I'd like to do a social experiment. And here's the social experiment. I will not make you meditate, pray more than 3 minutes. But if you need to leave, could you wait until we're done with the 3 minutes? Because I know ever so often people need to leave early, and it just kind of becomes disruptive. But I would like us for 3 minutes to really just focus. And I'm going to read Philippians 4:8. And I want you to think, first, what are the things that you're feeling the most content about? And then I'm going to ask you to think about what is the one thing that's agitating you the most. And then we're going to conclude with you in prayer, taking that item that agitates you the most to God and thanking God for the thing that actually really brings you joy. So let's begin. Let's enter into a time of prayer. I'm going to read Philippians 4:8, and then we'll be quiet for 3 minutes. Finally, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things.